Hey everyone, today let's look at features that got removed from Dead by Daylight due to the controversy surrounding them. Failed mechanics, if you will. Let's get into it. Secret interactions. This was something present from the very early days of the game all the way up until just a few years ago when the last of these features were removed. One of the last to go being the light burn mechanic for Wraith and Nurse. This mechanic being a sort of hidden counter to these two killers specifically, which may seem odd as they don't appear all too similar. However, there's actually a lore reason behind them sharing this mechanic, which is that they both interact with the same sub-realm within the entity named the Spirit World. Wraith accesses this fully by cloaking, and Nurse enters it briefly via her blinks. The light burn mechanic itself allows survivors to shine their flashlight onto either a cloaked Wraith or a Nurse charging her blink, and subsequently stun them out of their power. It took 2 seconds to burn them out and could be done as many times as possible. This was controversial largely for Wraith as this mechanic barely affected the Nurse, who had a much narrower window for it to activate on. Wraith players often ended up getting somewhat bullied by this mechanic and found it hard to avoid the flashlight beam, as all it took was 2 consistent seconds of it being shone onto a Wraith whilst cloaked, with it being even easier originally at just 1 second. I think this is an interesting mechanic too, but clearly quite problematic in this state, and so adding, say, an additional 2 seconds, making it take 4 seconds overall, seems more reasonable. Removing it entirely does feel unfortunate though, as it's almost this secret mechanic or encounter you can have with a specific killer under specific circumstances, which I love. These mechanics appeared throughout the game in a number of ways. Trapper originally could be affected by the Saboteur perk, and also toolboxes. If survivors used these to disarm traps, they would permanently break the trap. This was one of the more negative instances that made the already weak Trapper even weaker. Trapper got a double whammy in fact, as the original version of Small Game actually allowed you to detect his traps as well, and only his traps, as totems didn't exist yet. This whole perk was made to counter Trapper and him only. You also just straight up saw the trap auras, which is crazy. This was the same for Hag, with her also suffering against Small Game. She also had a flashlight interaction, with you being able to break her traps by shining a flashlight onto them for a short period. Flashlights could also be used to dispel crow swarms against Artist. Freddy had a unique interaction with the perk Adrenaline, where survivors would wake up from the dream world when Adrenaline activated. This was something much more harmless, I'd argue, and quite lore-fitting, and once again, quite a cool idea. All of these though have been removed, with the idea being that an item or a perk shouldn't give you an advantage over the other side, making it inherently controversial. It's debatable if you'd consider this a failure as a mechanic. From my perspective, it is though, and I only say that because I personally love these kinds of mechanics, but I do realize it's a hot take. Some I realize are obviously horrendously unhealthy, such as the ones that affected Trapper, but certain quirky interactions like Adrenaline interacting with Freddy seem so harmless to me and make for really unique and rare moments. I think compromising to allow for this feature to remain, but maybe adjusted slightly to not be so overpowered in some instances, would make these mechanics truly fascinating to have as part of the game. Interesting and unique mechanics that offer up small yet risky forms of counterplay that would be exciting to pull off in-game and would require more experienced killers to be wary of and learn about. The other thing of course is introducing the same for the killer side. Let the killers also get their own specific interactions. Maps. Interestingly, throughout DBD history, there's actually been a decent number of maps that got removed from the game, and pretty much all of them have been controversial in one way or another. The only ones that weren't, I'd argue, was some of the base game's map variants. For Macmillan, Coldwind, and Autohaven, these were always pretty tolerated or liked. One of the most notable and I think controversial was RPD. You may be thinking, well, RPD is still here, so clearly it hasn't been removed. Well, the original version of RPD that dropped with the first Resident Evil Chapter in June 2021 actually had the whole RPD, and not the RPD we have now, which is separated into parts. This RPD encompassed the whole place and was seemingly almost an exact replica of the version from Resident Evil 2. There was initial controversy surrounding this, as it seems that consoles actually couldn't handle the map, likely down to the size mainly, as it was up until that point in time, and I believe even up until now, the largest map DBD has ever seen. So the map was huge, had multiple floors, indoor and outdoor areas, and was basically largely inaccessible for a lot of the killer roster. The thing that actually made it get changed though was the library. At one point in time you could actually go to the upper floors of the library. All there was up there was a thin walkway, a drop down vault, and occasionally a totem, making it also one of few maps to have 4 floors. floors: the ground level, the first floor, the basement, and the second floor library. As a feature, this was received fairly poorly. The removal of the library is interesting too, as it was removed due to boil over of all perks. In patch 5.5.0, boil over received a catastrophic change where instead of progressing the current wiggle progression by a percentage, it increased the total and by a whopping 25%. This caused a very bad situation where survivors could easily run to the upper floors of the library and essentially become unhookable. Therefore, the library was closed off forever, the map briefly removed from the game, and eventually returning with its current rework. So this was a complete failure, right? Well, yeah, but I do think the concept of an additional floor like this is an interesting idea. There have been other implementations of verticality or additional map floors too. For example, Devaka actually does it very well, having a fourth floor on the top of its main structure, which is largely quite harmless, and I think this is the key. RPD was already bloated, yet added in this additional room on a whole new floor to the rest of the map. It was inevitable it would cause some problems eventually. This then resulted in RPD being briefly removed from the game entirely, and eventually returning with the second Resident Evil chapter, Project W, where it was presented in its new format of 2 smaller variants or wings. This was easily the most controversial map the game had ever seen, from its bugs, crashes, ridiculous size, 4 floors, and then the final straw of an unhookable area. However, there have been others too. Haddonfield is another good example, where despite it getting reworked quite a lot, it never quite seemed to find a healthy spot, always having issues with its long fences, and originally with the Infinite inside of its main building. This, however, was eventually removed due to the Halloween license being lost. The other majorly controversial map or maps that got removed were Badham 2 to 5, with us currently only having Badham 1 in the map pool. This one is bizarre, as Badham from its launch to the current day has been hated for its heavy favouring of the survivor side, so when it came out with 5 variants it was quite perplexing. Their removal is certainly welcome. Free DLC. This was an idea that sort of existed throughout DBD history. Originally it was a planned thing for the first few DLCs of the game. The very first chapter the game ever received, The Last Breath, was entirely free, featuring Nurse and Nia. After this, all subsequent chapters were originally purchase only, with the exception of A Lullaby for the Dark and Left Behind, which are free. I got them for free at least, but I know varying platforms don't get them for free, and others get different chapters for free, so it's probably like the first couple you get for free. This was the official end of free DLC though, all until the mechanic of Splinter Offerings was introduced. This was a mechanic to allow people to play DLCs for free, and even licensed ones. A way to let people test killers and try them out before deciding if they wanted to buy them. They looked really cool too and were of iridescent quality. Each had a unique name and let you play the character it was linked to for a single trial, with the caveat being that you couldn't run any add-ons or perks on the character. The Shock Splinter let you play the Doctor, the Muddy Splinter let you play the Hag, and so on. But there was a really cool feature of this free DLC, which was that you could actually play licensed characters too, with Splinter offerings such as the Bone Splinter letting you play Bubba, or the Glass Splinter letting you play the Pig. It was really nice that there was this ability to play characters you'd otherwise have to buy with real money. These unfortunately were removed completely from the game in patch 3.6.0 or March 2020. This was seemingly done as a result of a series of bugs, allowing players to simply play characters for free. It was also down to the offerings cluttering the blood web and diluting the iridescent pool. However, I'd argue the add-ons failed much more substantially aside the bugs. The add-ons were greatly flawed and controversial, as they only let you trial the character add-onless and perkless, which often didn't give you a very good impression of the character, nor make you want to play them again generally. I remember using the Bubba Splinter back in the day, and the whole match I was just trying to figure out how his chainsaw even worked, and by the end he was one of my least favourite killers I'd ever played as I got completely rolled. With this all said, the idea here is sound. It's a good idea to allow people to trial killers for free. So here's my idea. Re-implement the Splinter offerings again, but this time change them so that you're able to equip a pieceback loadout, composed of only the killer's teachable perks and the base game perks. For example, you could trial as Bubba, but you're only allowed to use his perks and the general or common perks. Then for add-ons, restrict them to just browns and greens, which are typically number changes but aren't half bad. This lets the user get a good feel for the character but clearly have restrictions in place for the fact that they haven't bought them, them, and for true freedom, need to buy them. Finally, I think it'd be cool to finally make use of the currently unused spectral rarity, a tealish tinted rarity that has never been put to use but is in the game files. Splinter offerings can fall into this new category, being one of the rarest add-ons to appear in the game. Maybe you can find a maximum of 1 spectral offering per prestige. A fitting thing considering you are being allowed to play a purchasable character completely for free. And then maybe just have these offerings just not appear if you already own the character. Earnable Cosmetics. These have existed over the years in a few forms, but only once in the way I want to talk about today. These existed with the original Bubba masks. These Bubba masks were masks that were unlockable on Bubba simply by playing the game. You didn't need to engage with an event, the store, or a purchase of any kind. It was completely free and tied to gameplay. There were 4 available, and you unlocked them by sacrificing each of the original 4 survivors 25 times, which would unlock you their face as a Bubba mask, which is horrifying by the way. Now I think most people can agree that conceptually this idea as a mechanic is actually really good, a way to earn a cool but small cosmetic completely for free by engaging with a character in the game. I think it's more the choice of cosmetic here that was the problem. There was a large controversy around these masks with targeted harassment, and it led to them eventually being removed due to how malicious players decided to use them. So this one doesn't even need fixing, really. They just need to add earnable cosmetics in a more straightforward and non-controversial way. Implement them instead as a reward cosmetic that shows off your dedication or mastery of a character. I think a cool way to do this for killers actually that would be really unique as well is to have unlockable power cosmetics. For example, Trapper's traps could be visually upgraded the more people you trap. Trapping 100 survivors, say, alters the trap to have additional teeth or something. 1000 traps and you get a new model entirely, and so on. This also keeps things away from any character visuals, and I hardly think power visual alterations could end up being controversial in any way, as long as they don't provide a gameplay advantage. The survivor side is a bit trickier, but I think a cool idea would be unlockable versions of base cosmetics, with visual upgrades to show character progress, like a more battle-hardened looking Dwight for example, showing a literal progress almost with the character you play. This is just a few ideas of course. I'd argue this is one of the easier controversial or failed mechanics that could be reintroduced fairly easily in likely a wide variety of ways successfully, so let me know too what you'd want to see get added. Moonlight Offerings. Moonlight Offerings are something that have not existed in the game for a while now, an offering many of you watching may have never seen or heard of. They released with the launch of the game in 2016 and came in 3 rarities, yellow, purple, and pink. The purpose of them was to change the lighting of the trial. The quarter moon bouquet would slightly brighten the trial, then the full moon bouquet would considerably brighten it. On the flip side was the crescent moon bouquet, which slightly dimmed the trial, and then the new moon bouquet, which made it incredibly dark. Almost unplayably dark actually, which is partially why this very overpowered offering was removed and was so controversial. It made some maps almost unplayable with how dark it got. This was the game's first ever mechanic I would deem failed. Even the devs agreed as they removed it, with the reason being that they wanted control over the lighting of the trials going forward. For all maps commencing the Moonlight Offerings removal from the Bloodweb have featured fixed lighting. We also nowadays have a brightness level slider, so having an offering affect these things doesn't make much sense anymore either. This is the same reason why the original effects of both Lightborn and Shadowborn were removed. Lightborn originally was able to dim your vision by 10%, and Shadowborn would increase your vision brightness by 20%. These ultimately becoming redundant nowadays, but also being nowhere near as controversial as the moon bouquets. So how and why should we reintroduce these? Well, for one, I don't think we should reintroduce them in the original format, as we literally don't need to. However, I do like the idea of being able to alter the lighting in the trials in some way. An original idea in fact documented as far back as the pre-alpha is the idea of the day and night cycles and weather cycles. It's also something that was revealed at the 10th year anniversary as an upcoming feature. So this is what I'd love to see Moonlight Offerings become. First off, we just need 2, I think. Purple rarity would be appropriate. Full moon bouquet causes the trial to spawn during the daytime. New moon bouquet causes the trial to spawn at nighttime. The final change being that the trials commencing forward would all have the possibility of spawning at day or night, but each having fixed lighting by the developer still. For example, you could have the current duskier daytime of Dead Dog, or a much moodier darker nighttime version, with you able to control it by using the Moonlight Offerings. This would be great too I think, as it would allow us to experience current bright maps like Coldwind and Eerie with darker lighting, which I think would make them really spooky actually. On the flip side, it would be cool to see a brighter, but not super bright mind you, version of darker maps like Macmillan or the Withered Isle. Add-ons with downsides. Add-ons having downsides to upsides is a feature that has been largely removed from the game over the years, although it does still remain in small ways, such as with the waterlogged shoe for Hag, which completely removes her ability to teleport, and in return you get an increased base movement speed and the ability to slow people with your traps. This I'd argue though isn't really the trade-off I'm talking about and is more of an alteration to the power overall. Add-on downsides was a mechanic that was heavily prevalent within the early days of the game, and notably on the Nurse and the Hag. First off on the Nurse, this appeared across almost all of her add-ons, with them having huge downsides alongside their upsides. Catatonic Boy's Treasure as an example increased the maximum blink range, but had the downside of decreasing blink accuracy, which I'm not too sure what that means by the way, possibly that your endpoint when blinking could be more varied or something. Others were Anxious Gasp, which increased blink movement speed, but decreased the charge speed. Then slightly more powerful ones like Campbell's Last Breath, which increased blink charges by 2, but decreased the overall blink range. These I'd say were interesting as a feature, but weren't really that practical in the way they were implemented. For Nurse it kind of makes sense, and was likely done because she was so powerful, and had such a game-breaking core power. The issue even here though, and the reason for a rising controversy, is that there just wasn't much of a reason to even run these. Especially back when Nurse had a base of 5 blinks, an extra 2 wasn't really worth the downside, where they could have actually posed an interesting trade-off. When it came to Hag's version of these add-ons, it was even worse, as she is obviously a weaker character than Nurse and was far weaker especially on release. Half Eggshell, for example, increased the trip duration of Hag's traps by 30%, but reduced the teleport range by 25%. That's a wildly bad trade-off for a character that at the time already had a very short teleport range, far shorter than her current base. Dried Cicada extended the teleport range by 30%, wow, quite substantial, but then made the trap set time 50% longer, which is just like, why? It's such a kick in the teeth to a character who doesn't need it. This was a common theme for all of the number change add-ons between Nurse and Hag, in the uncommon up to rare rarities. This luckily stopped after Hag for the most part, and was reworked decently quickly into the kind of add-ons we see for them today. But why do this? Why give them these horrible downsides to decent effects? I don't think this is even a terrible idea, as the idea of having a downside for an upside is fine, as long as it makes sense. The trade-off needs to be worthwhile. Say if the teleport range is increased by 10%, then it's silly to whack on a 20% nerf to set speed. It just feels punishing for what isn't enough of a reward. Obviously the other pitfall here is that then add-ons could get too large an upside for too small a downside. This is why the add-ons that just completely alter playstyle do this best, as it's more of a trade-off of ability over numbers. This could also maybe work better as a glass cannon type of effect, where you give highly powerful bonuses, but apply something very crippling if used poorly, like an infinite teleport range, but the downside is your traps are halved or something like that. This makes it a bit more fun at the very least I think, and gets you to commit to that extreme playstyle of playing at range, but at a cost. Hatch Incremental Spawn. This is our final and smaller feature that I wanted to touch on, as there's been general controversy surrounding the hatch as a whole in recent years. I thought it'd be interesting to look back at a time when the hatch once spawned when there were 4 survivors in the trial, with this happening at 1 gen remaining, and scaled based on remaining survivors and gens completed. If 3 survivors were alive, it spawned at 2 gens, if 2 were alive, it spawned at 3, and if 1 was alive, it spawned at 4. This was the incremental spawn mechanic and allowed for 4 players to escape via the hatch with 1 gen left. All it required was a key to open the hatch early. It even had an achievement tied to it that required you to escape with 4 survivors through the same hatch. This was controversial for obvious reasons, with it making games often cut off early, due to whole teams just dipping out via the hatch instead of playing the match out. It disrupted the whole flow of regular trials and even caused people with keys to get tunneled ruthlessly, which seems crazy nowadays when keys are so inconsequential. The thing is, it did have upsides, I'd argue. For one, keys had a clear and powerful purpose, but also chests were a much more impactful mechanic, as you can find keys in them that could genuinely result in you escaping early or surviving the game. Chests too nowadays are just so irrelevant with the massive items you get given in Bloodwebs. The incremental spawn also arguably made the hatch kind of irrelevant too, where nowadays it's essentially just a final survivor pity mechanic, which is fine I think, but it does put into question why we need it at all, if that's all it is. The hatch hatch having an incremental spawn though was inherently unhealthy, so I don't even necessarily want to suggest an alteration to this, or something that could improve it. The hatch as a whole is unique but flawed and overall shirks the flow of the game. I do somewhat like the idea that the hatch could spawn in early and be openable for a team, but only once all gens have been completed, and then possibly also requiring a special hatch key. This could possibly be separated into 3 parts across the 3 chests of the trial, with all of them required to be recovered and connected to then finally open the hatch, making it almost a secondary objective or means of escape over the exit gates. What do you think? And what do you think about these features or mechanics overall? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.